Follow up, you said Iran was behind the attack. So what does that mean? Have you seen evidence of financing or directing anything specific to this attack? Not just generally, but specifically.
So maybe I need to clarify further from what Lita had mentioned. We know that Iran funds these groups, like Kataib Hezbollah. We know that these IRGC-backed militias are the ones responsible for attacks on our troops in Iraq and Syria. Beyond that, we're doing an intelligence assessment. We don't have. I can't give you today that.
This attack, linking it to Iran.
We just know that Iran funds these groups, like Kataib Hezbollah and other groups that have attacked our forces. But I don't have more to share on that. As a general matter, yes.
This breaking news, by the way, the Biden administration is getting a ton of pressure from the Pentagon, Department of Defense, from people within his own circle to strike against Iran after the latest strike near Jordan that killed 3 U.S. troops. Now, what I want to do is I want to read to you from the latest news. Then afterwards, I'm going to add some thoughts of my own, a little bit of history, because what the media is doing, predictably here, is telling you part of the story, and just letting your emotions ride. 3 U.S. troops are killed, and we should do something about it. Meanwhile, the U.S. is complicit in millions of deaths, indirectly and directly, through weapons sales to countries like Saudi Arabia, the ghoulish country that gave us 9/11, Al Qaeda, and Boko Haram, and all that fun stuff, right? And we still cover up for them. By the way, the United States still covers up for Saudi Arabia regarding the attacks of 9/11 in a civil suit case in the Southern District of New York. So much for the word justice around here. Nevertheless, let's read from here. As you can see, Biden faces pressure to strike Iran if the U.S. troops are killed. And let me X this. It says here, the killing of 3 U.S. troops and wounding of dozens more on Sunday by Iran-backed militants is piling political pressure on President Joe Biden to deal a blow directly against Iran, a move he's been reluctant to do out of fear of igniting a broader war. Well, you know what? Obama shared the same sentiments. Obama was heavily pressured by the Israeli government, more so than his own circles. The Department of Defense was dead set against it because geographically it's not feasible. They can, it's not going to be Iraq, for example, where Iraq is weakened by sanctions and internal strife. Iran's hurt by sanctions, but not to the point where they're defeated. And they have a formidable military and hundreds of years of fighting within their blood. And that's the Persians for you. Much different than the Baathists, much different than the Arab. Can't really fight that much. The Persians can, like Afghanis. Biden's response options, and by the way, 20 years in Afghanistan against the Taliban. What do you think is going to happen in Iran? This is the reason why we're reluctant to strike. Or else, we would invade like we did Iraq. Whether it's a lie or a false flag, doesn't matter. They know that Iran is a dangerous threat to the United States. But Israel's pushing it. That's where the pressure is coming from. Part of it. We also have the conservatives, who some are heavily involved with the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. Then you have opposing views like J Street, don't want war. The liberal Jews who are heavily criticizing the Netanyahu government, which are run by a bunch of psychopaths at this point. No, I'm not using that term loosely. Biden's response options can range anywhere from targeting Iranian forces outside to even inside Iran. Yeah. Or opting for a more cautious retaliatory strike solely against the Iran-backed militants responsible, experts say. American forces in the Middle East have been attacked more than 150 times by Iranian-backed forces in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, north the coast of Yemen since the Israel-Hamas war erupted in October. Everything's going to make sense once I explain how the history between these two countries. Now, I'm not going to go back to 1953 with the overthrow of the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, which was a CIA-backed coup to implement Raza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, or the Shah of Iran, who was a Western puppet, until he was overthrown by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1980. Because they kidnapped the American civilians, and the Iran-Contra deal, which saw a big Reagan-esque mess in which later President Ford would allocute the determination of some of those sentences, including Caspar Weinberger, a Reagan insider. But until Sunday's attack at a remote outpost known as Tower 22 near Jordan's northeast border of Syria, the United States are also in Syria. Remember the Arab Spring 2011, the United States are invited to fight against who? Al-Qaeda. Who were they actually funding? Al-Qaeda affiliates. To do what? To overthrow the Assad government through a CIA-backed operation called Timber Sycamore. Who entered that program? Well, Donald Trump did in 2017. That program ran for 5 years. Imagine, 5 years went to training, military aid to jihadists, in which we were invited to Syria to fight against the terrorists that we were funding. Well, we weren't only ones. Israel was involved. Turkey was involved. Saudi Arabia was heavily involved, of course. Whenever you deal with covert operations involving Wahhabi militants, Saudi Arabia is 100% involved, because that's where Wahhabi comes from. Jordan was involved. It was a big operation, Timber Sycamore. I've done a couple of videos on this. That's why we were in Syria. Biden said the United States would respond without giving any more details. By the way, the evidence, as you saw with the video before this, the evidence is the United States, Biden administration says, well, we think Iran did it. We don't need to show evidence for it. Republicans accuse Biden of letting American forces become sitting ducks, waiting for the day when a drone or missile would evade base defenses. They say that day came on Sunday when a single one-way attack from a drone struck near base barracks early in the morning. In response, they say Biden must strike Iran. He left our troops as sitting ducks, said Tom Cotton, who's a known warmongering piece of shit and never saw a war he didn't like. Has been calling for a conflict with Iran and China for years. The only answer to these attacks must be a devastating military retaliation against Iran's terrorist forces, both in Iran and across the Middle East. Oh, you're talking about Saudi Arabia. You're talking about Turkey. You're talking about Qatar, Yemen. Iran has some problems, but not to the extent that you think that they're an exporter of terrorism. Now, there's about 3,000 U.S. troops based in Jordan, which is a key U.S. ally. And approximately 2,500 of those troops are in Iraq, who, by the way, were there at the invitation of the Iraqi government as part of that U.S. coalition deal to prevent the resurgence of the jihadist Wahhabi groups, which, by the way, still has a presence there even after the Taliban took over. You have the Islamic State in Khorasan, Al-Qaeda. By the way, Al-Qaeda is serving in the Taliban government, thanks to Bill Roggio, a legendary counterterrorism reporter, who wrote a fantastic article showing that the Taliban are actually implementing Al-Qaeda as part of their government, high levels. So be on the lookout for them in the next 8 years. Now, according to the BBC, there's about 900 U.S. personnel in Syria, troops. And officially, they're there, quote unquote, officially there to support the anti-ISIS ally, the Kurdish Syrian Democratic, the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, excuse me. And that's in the southeast region or northeast, one of those. But the Assad government is saying that the U.S. presence in the country is an actual occupation. And when you have a presence within the country that is taking oil and supporting Salafi militants to overthrow Assad, you overstayed your welcome. And that's exactly what the U.S. government did. Now, the Iran-U.S. relations of the past 10 years can be boiled down to a number of different economic sanctions that have been placed on the Ali Khomeini government. And this goes back to, the 2019 Iranian shoot down of a U.S. drone that was ordered by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, Hossein Salami, who currently is the commander-in-chief, taking over for Qasem Soleimani after he was assassinated by the United States. And you also had a number of incidents, in the past 5 years, like the alleged American jamming of Iranian drones in July of 2019, the Iran gasoline price protests, where the Iranian authorities raised gasoline prices for civilians and imposed strict rationing rules, in which the United States expressed its support for the protesters, even funded them, through the CIA, of course, because they were condemning the Iranian government. And who supported this? Well, the ex-CIA director, Mike Pompeo. And don't forget Stephanie Grisham, who was a White House official under the Trump administration. The Kataib Hezbollah U.S. attacks in Iraq in December of that year, which led to what I think was the precipitator of the conflict that we see now, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. And that happened on January 3rd, 2020. Soleimani was head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force. And he was such a legend because in Syria, he was helping the Assad government eliminate the Islamic State in Levant, ISIS. And he was known as the slaughterer of sheikhs, slaughterer of the martyr. And the Quds Force actually was doing really good work there. Iranian proxy armies in Syria working with the Syrian army in the elimination of CIA, Israeli, Jordanian-backed, Saudi-backed Wahhabi groups. This is the reason why Qasem Soleimani was assassinated. Not that he was a threat, which the United States basically said he was. Because that's what Kelly Craft, the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, said in a letter to the UN Security Council, which she said the act was one of self-defense. Right. No, it was because Soleimani was actually, and the Quds Force was actually helping the Assad government kill off the Islamic State in Levant and other al-Qaeda Wahhabi groups who were being funded, not at that time, who were formerly funded by the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordanian, governments in order to overthrow Assad. Now we want to overthrow Iran. And what country has a similar interest? Well, it's Israel. Israel for years considered Syria, Lebanon, and Iran as the enemy. Now, I've said in previous latest videos, update videos about what's going on in the world, about what I think is a regional war, a broader war from that's centered in Gaza. And the fear was that the Israeli military would extend to West Bank, and then from there to Hezbollah, south of the country. I'm sorry, north of the country, to Lebanon, and in which the U.S. would intervene and act as the big brother to Israel in military, and Iran would be involved. Now, when Soleimani was killed, Khomeini, Ali Hossein Khomeini, declared that there would be severe revenge against the United States for this. And there were tens of thousands, I think over 300,000 people went to his funeral. And when that happened, in the week of the funeral, the United States actually announced 3,000 additional troops to the Middle East, particularly from 82nd Airborne Division, because they feared Iranian attack. And what happened in return was you had months later, the Iranian government ordered an attack on 2 military bases in Iraq. But there was a lot of words between the two governments, the United States and Iran. Nothing really came much of it. I think they both had a stalemate here. The United States didn't want to go into an all-gauge war with Iran. Meanwhile, Israel is the antagonist here, with Saudi Arabia basically acting as a silent partner. Because for them, I think, this is a religious war between Sunni and Shia, in which Saudi Arabia wants to be the sole superpower of the Middle East. But they're in denial, because that would belong to Israel. May not seem like it, but it is. Because Israel has the United States and coalition partners and the United Nations on their side, getting them to do whatever they want, engage in conflicts, coups, all over the Middle East. You'll notice none of the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, are not attacked, even for their participation at some level of the 9/11 attacks. Iraq was attacked, Afghanistan was attacked, later Syria and Libya on part of the war on terrorism, and Pakistan. But Saudi Arabia never was. Why? You know why. Because they pay millions and millions, hundreds of millions annually to the U.S. government. We ain't ruining that. So Iran basically is now under this U.S. threat of future sanctions, because in May of 2020, and I forgot to add this, Iran would aid Venezuela by sending oil tankers, in which 5 Iranian tankers carrying tens of millions of dollars worth of petrol was sailed to Venezuela as part of a wider deal between the two sanctioned nations by the U.S., Venezuela and Iran. The United States was seeking to seize Iranian tankers sailing toward Venezuela, and reports suggest that 4 U.S. Navy warships were in the Caribbean for a possible confrontation with those Iranian tankers. However, in a surprising turn of events, United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres, if you'll remember, warned against America's involvement in deploying its Navy in the Caribbean in order to intervene and create disruption against Iran and Venezuela's trade agreement. And also later on that year, and I reported on this, this is something that wasn't really proven, Abu Muhammad al-Masri, also known as Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah, who is a high-ranking Egyptian member of al-Qaeda, second in command, was killed in Tehran, Iran, shot to death by Israeli agents. Mike Pompeo at the time confirmed his death, although here's the funny thing. This was trying to draw al-Qaeda into Iran. You know where this is going, just like with Iraq. Remember that one? Where they tortured Sheikh Ibn al-Libi in Egypt? Basically said, tell us what we want to know. Al-Qaeda was in Iraq procuring chemical biological weapons. That went to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who went to the United Nations Security Council, and we went to war. Well, here we go again, 2020. Summer, late summer 2020, August. It just so happens Abu Muhammad al-Masri, who was under house arrest in Iran, just like a number of al-Qaeda and bin Laden's family were, and this was reported by the Times in 2003. And back then, the Iranian government, who had these members under house arrest, went to the United States and in Switzerland, went to U.S. officials, and said, we'll give you bin Laden's eldest son, Saad, I think, bin Laden. And they said no. Now, the reason why is simple, I think, was that so they can leave al-Qaeda in Iran and basically say, you see, Iran's harboring terrorists. Well, here we have Abu Muhammad al-Masri, an Egyptian member of al-Qaeda, supposedly assassinated by Israeli Israeli Mossad agents, in which former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who would later become the Secretary of State under Trump, confirming the death. Here's the thing. There's no proof of this ever happening. This is a great thing. So you could see right away what the United States was trying to do. They were trying to say, aha, you see, Iran is the biggest exporter of terrorism. You probably heard that from Fox, MSNBC, Pentagon-backed officials going on these shows, retired generals. Well, Iran's the biggest exporter of terrorism. No, that would be Saudi Arabia and the United States. Now, Netanyahu had tried for years to pressure Obama to engage in a conflict with Iran, and he rebuffed him, which led Obama to be heavily criticized by the Israeli government. They weren't very much friendly. So one thing about the Obama administration I respected was that they basically tended to not want to engage in a war that would have been worse than Iraq. Bush's mistake. And he didn't do it. One of the few good things Obama didn't do. So when Biden became president, he chose Antony Blinken for Secretary of State. And Blinken was against the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that began under Obama, in which Obama allowed for the Iranian government to procure some enriched uranium, which was vetted by the International Atomic Agency. And there's been reports of the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, in which they reported that, yes, Iran is procuring enriched uranium, but not at the levels where they procure nuclear weapons. So even the IAEA is against the U.S. government's, well, the Department of State's position that Iran was procuring nuclear weapons. Netanyahu just basically lied. He went to the United Nations twice and said that Iran has nuclear weapons. In fact, they're building one in a carpet factory. Oh, I'm not joking. He actually said that. He said this building was procuring chemical weapons. He showed you a picture. Meanwhile, it was a carpet factory. That's because the Israeli government are a bunch of liars and psychopaths. So in April of 2021, you had Congress which endorsed Resolution H-118, in which they expressed support for Iranian people's desire for a democratic republic. Because all of a sudden now we care about democracy. And what did Blinken do? No, unlike Pompeo, who wasn't as aggressive as Blinken, Blinken said that he was going to rule out military intervention to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, even in the face against the IAEA's reports. And the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signatories, which were holding talks in Vienna that year, with the goal of bringing the United States and the Iranian government into compliance back with the agreement that Trump eliminated. And so this is the reason why we have such an aggressive policy against Iran. And hopefully that gives you, without losing you, gives you a little bit of a historical background about why there's tensions between the two countries. I could have went back 50 years, but let's keep it recent. That's not enough to show that there's a terrible foreign policy record regarding the Middle East. I don't know what to tell you. It's a disaster. And it didn't matter if it was Obama or Trump or Biden. They were a failure. Obama not so much with Iran, but Trump and Biden were just terrible. And now you have Iranian militias in Syria bombing U.S. Base, outposts and bases. Why? Because the United States is the aggressor here. They're not the defenders. They're in Syria based on what? The alleged war on terror. Well, the alleged war on terror is over. So why are they still there? You know why they're fucking there. Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's why. The foreign policy of those two countries coexist with U.S. foreign policy, even though they're sometimes diametrically opposed. Religiously, they are. But this is not a productive foreign policy for hegemony in the region. Would you not agree? And I'm not going to be here sitting with the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is a murderous regime. They kill protesters, they hang gays, throw them off buildings. Not to say they don't have problems. Same thing with the Assad government, who is a notorious murderer. There's no clean hands here. I'm not going to be one of those people who say, well, Ali Khamenei and Bashar al-Assad and King Abdullah, these are all people that are, the victim. The only victims here are the people, the common people, as with every single conflict and battle and war since time immemorial. And us, because this is happening in our name. And our economy is hurting because of it. Because while billions of dollars go to the Department of Defense, and while hundreds of millions go to procuring weapons for these wars and conflicts, and while you have an American people that don't know whether they're a man or a woman, black or white, Christian or Jew, Democrat or Republican, and while you're fighting all these transparent, irrelevant ideologies, you're not focusing on the bigger issues that are killing people. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, literally displacing millions. Now you know where you get your refugee crisis from. So, all right, that's it for the video today. I just wanted to bring up a update video about what's going on, and I'm hoping cooler heads prevail. But if there's any more updates, of course, I will let you know and keep you updated without bias, without prejudice. Have a good night, everybody.